There is a theory. It's not mine. It belongs to the neurologists and the sleep researchers and the circadian biologists who study the human body's relationship with darkness and the small hours of the night. They call it the nadir of the circadian cycle, the bottom of the human biological clock, the lowest point of core body temperature, of cortisol, of alertness, of every physical system that keeps you anchored to the waking world. It occurs in most people between 3 and 4 in the morning. The scientists use this to explain why shift workers make more errors between 3 and 4, why most medical emergencies in hospitals occur in that window, why the body, when it is very old or very sick, most commonly chooses that hour to stop. They use it to explain why people wake at 3 a.m. in fear without knowing why the darkness at that hour has a different texture than the darkness at midnight or 5 a.m., why the mind, stripped of its daytime defenses, stripped of cortisol and light, and the noise of a waking world, becomes permeable. That's the word they don't quite use but keep dancing around, permeable. Open to things it keeps closed the rest of the time. The people in tonight's compilation woke at 3 a.m., or they were already awake at 3 a.m., working, driving, sitting in a hospital corridor, walking a field, standing in their own kitchens in the dark. They were at the nadir, the lowest point, the hour when the body is most quiet and the world is most dark, and whatever moves in the space between one world and the next moves most freely. What they found at that hour, what found them, is what I'm going to tell you tonight. 10 people, 10 nights, 10 moments at the bottom of the clock. I want you to notice something as you listen. Notice what time it is right now. Notice whether the house around you is quiet. Notice whether, somewhere in the last few moments, you heard something you haven't yet explained. Good. Now we can begin. Open book chapter 1, The Kitchen Light. Nora was not the kind of person who thought much about 3 a.m. She was a high school chemistry teacher. She went to bed at 10:30 on weeknights, set an alarm for 6, and slept the solid, deep sleep of someone who had spent the day managing 30 teenagers and their relationship with the periodic table. She did not have insomnia. She did not wake in the night. Sleep, for Nora, was a clean and untroubled country she entered every evening and left every morning without incident. Until the August she started waking at exactly 3:14 every night. Not approximately 3 a.m., not somewhere between 3 and 4. Her phone, checked the moment her eyes opened in the dark, read 3:14 every single time, for 11 consecutive nights, not 1 minute earlier, not 1 minute later. She told her husband Marco on the 4th night. He was sympathetic and practical in the way of engineers. He suggested she might be subconsciously responding to a sound, an environmental cue, something that recurred at that time with enough regularity to act as an alarm. She agreed that was probably it. She lay awake trying to identify the sound. Traffic pattern, neighbor's schedule, something mechanical in the house. There was nothing. The neighborhood was residential and quiet. The house was a 2009 build with no particular mechanical quirks. The street at 3:14 a.m. in August in Tucson was silent under the particular dry weight of a desert night. On the 5th night, she got up. She didn't have a reason exactly. She was awake, and her mind was too active to lie in the dark, and she thought she would get a glass of water and maybe read until she felt tired again. She put on her glasses and padded down the hall in her bare feet and went to the kitchen. The kitchen light was on. She was certain, the specific daily certainty of habit, that she had turned every light off before bed. She was meticulous about this. It was a system she'd maintained since college, the last check of the night routine. Lights, stove, front door, back door. She had done it that night. She always did it. The kitchen light was on. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, telling herself that Marco had come down for something and forgotten to turn it off. She looked at the kitchen. The glass he would have used was not in the drying rack. The tap was not dripping the way it did when recently used. Nothing in the kitchen indicated anyone had been in it since the evening. She turned the light off. She got her water in the dark. She went back to bed. The sixth night, 3:14 a.m., eyes open. She lay still this time, listening, quiet. Then she got up, walked to the kitchen. The light was on. She turned it off, went back to bed, did not tell Marco. The seventh night, same. The eighth, same. On the ninth night, she sat down at the kitchen table with the light on and waited. She waited for 40 minutes, sitting in the kitchen in her nightgown with her hands flat on the table, watching the room, watching the light, watching for anything that would explain why the light was turning itself on while she slept. Nothing happened. She turned off the light and went back to bed. On the 10th night, she woke at 3:14. She lay still. She did not get up. She stared at the ceiling and she made a decision that she described to me 18 months later as the most rational and the most irrational thing I have ever done simultaneously. She said to the ceiling, "What do you want?" The kitchen light at the far end of the hall turned off. It had been on. She had not turned it on, she had gone to bed with it off as always. But when she spoke, it turned off, as if something had been keeping it on and had, at the sound of her voice, let go of it. She lay still for a very long time. Then she got up and walked to the kitchen. The light was off. The kitchen was dark and ordinary. But on the kitchen table, the table she had sat at 2 nights before with her hands flat on the surface, waiting, something was different. Her mother's photograph. The photograph normally lived on the hallway shelf. It was a framed picture of Nora's mother, Pillar, taken at a family gathering in 2011. Pillar had died in February of that year, a stroke, in her sleep, in a hospital 3 states away, in the early hours of the morning. The photograph was on the kitchen table, face up, centered on the table with a deliberateness that was unmistakable. Nora sat down across from it. She sat with it for a long time in the dark kitchen in the middle of the August night, with the desert silence pressing against the windows, and she cried. Not from fear. She told me this explicitly, and I believe her, because of the way she described what came after. She said she stopped crying. She sat up straight. She looked at the photograph. She said, "Okay, Mama, I hear you. I'm going to be okay." She went back to bed. On the 11th night, she woke at 3:14 for the last time. She lay still. The house was quiet. She turned her head and looked down the hall toward the kitchen. The light was off. It has stayed off every night since. I asked Nora what she thought her mother wanted. She said she'd thought about that for a long time. Her mother had been a worrier, the particular, devoted kind of worrying that immigrant mothers do, the kind that doesn't stop because of distance or illness or death. In February of that year, Nora and Marco had been going through a very hard time, marital difficulties. Nothing they couldn't work through, but real and serious, and the kind of thing that a mother would feel, even from 3 states away, even from wherever it is people go. She said, "I think she was checking on me. I think she found the light and she used it. I think she was just there, the way she always was, the way she always would be at 3 a.m. if she thought I needed her, sitting in the kitchen in the middle of the night waiting for me to come and talk to her." She paused. She always kept the kitchen light on for me. I asked what happened on the morning after the last night, the 11th night, when the light stayed off. Nora said, "I called Marco's mother. I hadn't talked to her in years. I don't know why, we just drifted. I called her and I said I was sorry and we talked for 2 hours. She looked at her hands. My mother would have wanted that. She always said family was the only thing you could take with you." She was quiet. I don't know, maybe that's what she came back to tell me. Maybe that's all it was, just family is the only thing. Open book chapter 2, The Long Shift. James has worked nights for 19 years. He prefers nights. He likes the specific quality of the world between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. The way sound carries differently, The way empty spaces feel inhabited by a deeper kind of quiet, the way the dark makes buildings honest. During the day, he says, a building performs. At night, it simply is. He has worked in hospitals, warehouses, office parks, a casino, 2 hotels. He has spent the better part of 2 decades walking the corridors of buildings that the world has gone home and left behind. And in those 19 years, he has developed the particular fearlessness of someone who has made peace with the dark. He told me this up front. He told me he needed me to understand that he was not a person who spooked, who misidentified sounds, who let an empty building play tricks on his mind. He needed me to understand that before he told me what happened in the Meridian office complex on a Tuesday night in March 2017, because he needed me to understand that James Ackhafer does not scare. What happened that night scared James Ackhafer. The Meridian complex was 4 buildings on a shared campus in Detroit's outer suburbs, 5 stories each, glass and steel, the anonymous modern architecture of corporate parks that could be in any city in any state. James had worked it for 2 years. He knew it the way he knew all his buildings, its sounds, its rhythms, the particular way the HVAC cycling sounded in Building C versus Building A, the elevator that had a slight mechanical hesitation on the 3rd floor of Building B, the fire door in D that never fully latched and had to be pushed firmly. His rounds took 45 minutes at a brisk walk. He did them twice per shift, at midnight and at 3 a.m. The 3 a.m. round on the Tuesday in March was like every other 3 a.m. round he'd done in 2 years at Meridian, until he reached the 5th floor of Building A. Building A's 5th floor housed the executive suite of the complex's primary tenant, a mid-size financial services company, corner office, conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows, a private bathroom and a kitchen. James had walked this floor hundreds of times. He knew it in his sleep. Knew the way the city lights came through those conference room windows and through long rectangles of orange and gold across the carpet at night. Knew the specific sound of his own footsteps on the hardwood of the executive corridor versus the carpet of the open office. He came through the stairwell door onto the 5th floor at 3:03 a.m. At the far end of the corridor, through the glass wall of the executive conference room, clearly visible from the stairwell door, a man was sitting at the conference table. Alone, in the dark except for the city light through the windows, sitting at the head of the table with his hands flat on its surface, facing the windows, facing the city. James had found people in buildings before, late workers, people who'd lost track of time. On 2 occasions over his career, people who shouldn't have been there at all. His protocol was clear. Announce himself, assess the situation, call it in. He walked the corridor toward the conference room. He announced himself, security, buildings closed, I need to see some ID, standard, firm, professional. The man at the table did not react. James pushed open the conference room door. He said it again, louder. The man did not move, did not turn his head, did not respond in any way. James stepped into the conference room. He got his flashlight up and onto the man. The seat at the head of the table was empty. James stood in the conference room doorway with his flashlight cutting through the dark, and the city light pouring through the windows in those long orange rectangles, and the chair at the head of the table empty, and his heart doing something he had not felt his heart do in 19 years of night work. He checked the room, every corner, the private bathroom off the conference room, the small kitchen off the corridor, the executive office itself, whose door was locked. He used his master key, every space on the 5th floor. Nobody. He stood in the corridor and wrote it up in his logbook with the same methodical handwriting he used for every entry, because the act of writing it down in the logbook made it a professional observation rather than a personal one, and James needed it to be professional right now. He wrote *3:03 a.m. Anomaly in 5th floor conference room, building A. Possible optical illusion related to light reflection from exterior. Area cleared. No personnel found. He walked the rest of his round. At 3:29 a.m., on his way back through Building A to the security desk, he took the elevator instead of the stairs. He was not afraid of the stairs. He took the elevator for no reason he could articulate then or now. The elevator opened on the 5th floor. He had pressed the ground floor button. He looked at the button panel. Ground floor was lit. He pressed it again. The doors stayed open. He looked down the corridor the way he had to look, the way the professional in him demanded. The conference room, the glass wall, the city light. The man was sitting at the table again. Same position, hands flat on the surface, facing the windows. James pressed the door close button. He pressed ground floor. He rode down and he walked out of Building A and he sat at the security desk, and he did not go back to the 5th floor for the rest of his shift. In the morning, he told the day supervisor he'd had a report of a possible intruder on the 5th floor and that it had been cleared. He did not say what he'd seen. He requested a different posting and transferred to a warehouse facility in Dearborn 2 weeks later. He did research, the way people do when they need an explanation to live with. The financial services company, the 5th floor's primary tenant, had been at Meridian for 11 years. Before them, the 5th floor had housed the executive offices of a regional manufacturing company that had gone into receivership in 2009. Before that, in the building's original configuration, the space had been different. He found a piece of local business reporting from 2003, a profile of a man who had founded the manufacturing company and run it for 20 years from that building. The man's name was Gerald Fitch. The article contained a photograph. Gerald Fitch had died in 2011 of a heart attack at his desk in the executive conference room on the 5th floor of Building A. The photograph showed him at the conference table, hands flat on the surface, facing the windows. James told me, "I've thought about what he was doing up there, sitting at his table in the dark at 3 in the morning. I've thought about what it would feel like to have built something, a company, a life's work, and to lose it, and then to not be able to leave the place where it happened." He was quiet. "I've done this job a long time. I've been alone in a lot of buildings at night, and what I've come to believe is that buildings hold the things that happened in them. They hold the weight of it, and sometimes, at night, when everything else is quiet." He stopped, started again. Gerald Fitch built that company. He ran it from that table. He died at that table. And then someone else moved in and used his table and put their name on his door, and he just couldn't let go of it. A long pause. "I don't blame him. I don't blame him one bit." Open Book Chapter 3, The Radio. Priya was awake at 3 a.m. on the Thursday night in November because she was always awake at 3 a.m. during her PhD thesis writing year. This is not unusual for doctoral students in their final year. The combination of deadline pressure, caffeine dependency, and the particular anxiety of a project that has consumed 5 years of your life produces a reliable and miserable insomnia that Priya and her cohort had normalized to the point of dark humor. She was at her desk in her studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian on Benefit Street, in the oldest residential neighborhood in Providence, surrounded by the controlled disorder of a thesis in its final 100 pages, stacks of annotated books, printed drafts with aggressive margin notes, 3 empty coffee cups she kept meaning to move. She was not afraid of the dark or of being alone or of old buildings. She was afraid of her methodology chapter, and that was quite enough to be afraid of. She did not own a radio. This is important. Priya was specific about it in her account to me because it is the detail around which everything else turns. She did not own a radio. She had never owned a radio. She was 29 years old and had moved 4 times in 6 years and had never at any point in her adult life possessed a radio of any kind. Her audio came from her laptop speakers or her phone or her earbuds, and that was it. No radio, not in the apartment, not anywhere she had ever lived. At 3:07 a.m. on the Thursday night in November, music came from the corner of her apartment. She heard it, and her first response was exactly what you would expect from a sleep-deprived graduate student at a desk in a Victorian building in an old New England city. She assumed it was coming from another apartment. A neighbor's radio or television, the sound bleeding through the old walls. She had experienced this before, an upstairs neighbor with a television she could sometimes barely hear as a murmur in the ceiling. She kept working. The music continued. She became aware over the next few minutes that it was not fading in and out the way transmitted sound through walls does. It was steady and constant, and coming from a specific point in her apartment, not above, not through the wall, but from the northeast corner. The corner where she had shoved her suitcases and a box of books she hadn't unpacked in 2 years. She turned in her chair and looked at the corner. There was a radio on top of the suitcase stack. An old radio, AM/FM, the kind with a physical dial, with a curved Bakelite casing in a dark reddish-brown that was either the original color or decades of age. It was playing something, a song she didn't recognize, with the particular tonal quality of recordings from the 1940s or 50s, the way the higher frequencies were slightly compressed, the way the orchestra sat in the middle of the sound field as if the whole band was in the same room with one microphone. Priya looked at the radio for a long time. Then she got up and walked to the corner. The radio was real, solid. She could feel the vibration of the speaker through the casing. She looked for a power cord. There was no power cord. She looked for a battery compartment. There was a battery door on the bottom, and she worked it open with a thumbnail, and inside, nothing. No batteries. The battery compartment was empty and had the furred look of a space that had held batteries at some point but not recently. The radio was playing, without batteries, without a power cord. The music was clear and warm and completely without source. She sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the suitcase stack, and she listened. The song ended. Another began, also from the 1940s, also orchestral, also in that compressed, intimate recording quality. She sat there for, she estimated, about 30 minutes. She did not think about her thesis. She did not think about methodology chapters. She sat on the floor in the corner of her studio apartment at 3 a.m. in November and listened to music on a radio that had no power. At some point, she became aware that the music had stopped. Not switched off, not faded, stopped, the way a record ends, a clean and final silence. She sat in the silence for a moment. Then she picked up the radio and looked at it more carefully. On the bottom, pressed into the Bakelite during manufacture, faded but legible, Zenith Radio Corp Chicago, ill. And beside it, not manufactured but scratched in by hand, someone's initials, RHB. And beside the initials, a year, *1947. Priya was a researcher. She started researching. The building on Benefit Street was converted to apartments in the 1970s. Before the conversion, it had been a single-family residence. The family who had owned it longest were the Beaumonts, a Providence family who had occupied the building from 1931 to 1968. The head of that household in 1947, when the radio would have been new, was one Robert Harold Beaumont. RHB. Robert Harold Beaumont died in 1962 at the age of 51 of cancer after a long illness. He died at home, in the Victorian on Benefit Street. According to his obituary in the Providence Journal, Robert Beaumont had been a devoted amateur radio enthusiast who had built his own receiver in the 1930s and kept a shortwave set in his study, in the northeast corner of what was now Priya's studio apartment. Priya told me she sat with that information for a long time before she knew what to do with it. She told me the strangest part was not finding the radio or the music or the initials. The strangest part was what happened the following morning when she went back to the corner to look at it again. The radio was gone. Not moved, not elsewhere in the apartment, not in the hall, not on the landing. Gone, as cleanly and completely as it had appeared. She has spent 2 years thinking about what Robert Beaumont was doing, playing his radio at 3 a.m. in November 2021, in the apartment carved from the house he'd lived and died in 59 years earlier. She offered me her best theory with the careful hedging of a scholar. He loved that radio. He built his first receiver by hand. He spent his evenings in that corner listening to big band music and shortwave broadcasts and whatever the world was sending out into the air that night. And I think some of that love is still in the walls, in the corner. And I think at 3 a.m. when the world is very quiet and I'm very awake and very alone, sometimes it. She stopped, started again. Sometimes the signal gets through. She has since finished her PhD. The corner of her apartment, she told me, is where she does her best work. She says she keeps the corner clear now, just in case. Open Book Chapter 4, The Field. Ray Kowalski farmed the same 240 acres in central Nebraska that his father had farmed and his father's father before that. He was born in the farmhouse. He expected to die there. He was a man with roots in the land so deep and so old they had become part of the geography. You couldn't remove Ray from those 240 acres without removing something essential from the land itself, and both Ray and the land knew it. He was not a man with much patience for things he couldn't explain. He had a farmer's relationship with mystery, limited. The world was soil and water and seed and weather and the mathematics of yield, and everything else was someone else's concern. He told me this before he told me the story. He needed me to understand that he was not the kind of man who had experiences like this, that what he was about to tell me had no business happening to Ray Kowalski of Custer County, Nebraska. It was July of 2008, a drought year, the third in a row, bad enough that Ray had been watching the sky with the specific hollow-eyed attention of a farmer who knows the math doesn't work if it doesn't rain. He was sleeping badly. Not from anxiety exactly, he was 67. He'd been through droughts before. He knew the calculus of hard years. But from the particular restlessness of a man whose relationship with the land is so total that when the land suffers, he suffers with it. He woke at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday night in July the way he always woke, all at once, fully alert, with no gradual surfacing, but this time with a specific and driving urgency he couldn't name. Not fear, closer to compulsion, the need to be outside. He put on his boots and his work shirt and walked out into the night. The night in central Nebraska in July is something particular. The sky is enormous in a way that city people don't have a word for, not just wide but deep, layered. The Milky Way so present it casts a shadow, the darkness between the stars darker than any darkness you'll find under light pollution. Ray had walked under that sky his entire life, and he knew it the way he knew the field grid and the irrigation layout. He walked out into the yard and stood for a moment, not going anywhere, just standing. Then he walked into the east field. He didn't know why the east field specifically. He just walked there, through the dry corn, the stalks chest-high and brittle with drought, rattling slightly against him as he moved through the rows to the center of the east field, where the ground was flattest and the sky was most open. He'd walked that field 10,000 times. He stood in the center of it. There was a man standing 40 feet away from him. An old man. That was Ray's first impression, processed in the moonlight and the starlight that was genuinely bright enough to see by on that July night. Old the way farmland makes men old, weathered, compact, a face like a topographic map. Dressed in clothing that Ray, at the first moment, could not quite resolve into the correct decade. Work clothes, but cut differently than work clothes cut now. Ray said, "Evening." The man said nothing. Ray said, "You lost." The man said nothing. Ray looked at the man more carefully. He was not moving, not shifting his weight, not blinking, not breathing with any movement Ray could detect. He was standing in the center of Ray's east field at 3 a.m. in July, as if he had been standing there for a very long time and was prepared to stand there for a very long time more. Ray said, "This is private land. You need to tell me what you're doing on my field." The man looked at him directly. For the first time since Ray had come into the field, the man looked at him. And Ray, 1960, 67 years of this land. A man who had pulled calves and buried cattle and driven combines through 100-degree days and fixed irrigation systems at midnight in the rain. Ray felt something move through him that he described to me with a precision that moved me. He said, "I felt recognized, not just seen, recognized, like whatever was standing in my field knew me the way I know the field, knew what I was made of, knew what I'd come from." The man looked at the ground between them, at the dry, cracked soil of Ray's east field in the third drought year. He crouched down. He picked up a handful of soil. He held it in his palm and looked at it. Then he looked at Ray. He opened his hand and let the soil fall. And as it fell, Ray swears this and swears it was not the moonlight or the exhaustion or the dry July air doing something to his vision. As the soil fell from the old man's hand, it was darker than it should have been. Not cracked and pale with drought. Dark and rich and loose, the color and texture of healthy, well-watered topsoil. The man stood up. He looked at Ray one more time. Then he walked away into the corn and was gone. Ray stood in the center of his east field for 20 minutes after that, in the dark and the dry heat and the enormous Nebraska sky. Then he walked back to the house. He told his wife in the morning. She listened the way a woman listens who has been married to a practical man for 40 years and is hearing him describe something impractical, carefully, without interruption, trying to hear what it meant rather than what it was. When he finished, she said, "Who do you think it was?" Ray said, "My grandfather's grandfather broke this land, homesteaded it in 1879, built the first house here and plowed the first furrow. His name was Alexander Kowalski." His wife said, "Do you have a photograph of him?" Ray said, "One, in the family Bible." She got the Bible. She opened it to the photograph tucked inside the front cover. She held it out to Ray. Ray looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Yeah." Ray told me he went back to the east field the next morning and looked for footprints, old habit, checking for deer and coyote. He found his own boot prints from the previous night. He found nothing else, no prints from any second person. He found something else, though. In the exact spot where the man had stood, where he'd crouched and picked up the soil, the ground was different. A rough circle, maybe 2 feet across. Soft, dark, moist, even in the third drought year. As if someone had reached into the earth and turned it back to what it had been. It rained 3 days later. The drought broke. Ray doesn't attribute the rain to Alexander Kowalski because he is a farmer and farmers don't make those kinds of causal claims. But he told me quietly at the end of his account, "I'll say this. I've walked every inch of that east field 1,000 times since then, and every year in the spot where he stood, the soil is different, darker, better. Whatever he did to it, whatever he put back into it, it held." He was quiet for a moment. "That land fed my grandfather and my father and me and my children, 4 generations off the same dirt. And one night at 3 a.m., the man who broke it first came back to make sure it was still good." He nodded slowly. "I think that's all he wanted, to know it was still good." Open Book Chapter 5, The Room at the End of the ICU. Sandra has been an ICU nurse for 16 years. She has held the hands of hundreds of dying people. She has been present for the specific moment. She describes it as the moment the room changes, more times than she can count. She is not a stranger to death. She respects it the way you respect something large and inevitable, and she has found, over 16 years, the professional distance that keeps a person functional in a job that would otherwise consume them. She is not someone who reports unusual experiences. She said this to me with the firmness of someone who has said it before, who has constructed her professional identity around the idea that she deals in facts and physiology and evidence-based medicine, not in what cannot be measured. She told me what happened in February 2013 because she has been carrying it for 11 years and needed to put it somewhere. The patient in room 14 of the ICU, she calls him Mr. Abrams, which is not his real name, was 83 years old and had been on the unit for 16 days following a massive stroke. He had no family. The social work team had located a niece in Florida who was making arrangements but had not come. There were no visitors. He lay in room 14 in the particular silence of a man who is present but already traveling, and Sandra checked on him every hour with the same care she gave every patient. She had been the one holding his hand for 12 of the 16 days. At 2:50 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, his monitors began the pattern that Sandra, with 16 years of practice, could read as clearly as a sentence. The slow, irregular descent. The breathing pattern that changed quality became effortful in a specific way, each breath a negotiation. She called the on-call physician and began the comfort care protocol, and settled in for what she had learned to recognize as the last hour of a person's life. At 3:04 a.m., Mr. Abrams died. Sandra noted the time, began the documentation, and sat with him for a moment, as she always did, as she believed everyone deserved before beginning the post-care process. Then she looked up. In the corner of room 14, near the window, there were two people. Not staff, not the physician. He had stepped out 2 minutes before to take an emergency call from another floor. Two people she had not seen enter the room, had not heard enter the room, who were standing in the corner near the window in the way of people who have been waiting in that corner for some time. A man and a woman. Older, the woman perhaps in her 60s, the man a decade older. The woman was crying, but quietly, with the contained grief of someone who has had time to prepare for this moment. The man had his arm around her shoulders and was watching Mr. Abrams with an expression that Sandra described, when she had worked through her own response enough to find language for it, as relief. The specific relief of someone who has been worried about someone for a very long time and has finally been able to see for themselves that it's okay. Sandra said, "Excuse me, I need to ask how you got in here." The man looked at her. He said nothing, but he looked at her with an expression that she struggled to describe and finally settled on. Grateful. He looked at me like I had done something he was grateful for. He looked back at Mr. Abrams. The woman wiped her eyes. She looked at Sandra too, briefly, with the same expression. Then she put her hand out toward the bed, toward Mr. Abrams, and Sandra saw, and she is insistent about this, she saw the moment of contact. The woman touched Mr. Abrams's hand, and then they were not there. Sandra stood in room 14 at 3:06 a.m. in February in Minneapolis, and felt the cold of the room, and heard the flat tone of the monitors, and stood with what she had just seen for a long moment before she was able to move again. She walked out of the room. She stood in the ICU corridor. She found the charge nurse and said carefully, "I need to check something. Who is authorized to be in room 14? The charge nurse said, "Nobody. The niece is in Florida. Did someone come in?" Sandra said, "I'm not sure." She went back to room 14. She checked every corner. She checked the bathroom. She looked at the window. The window was sealed, as all ICU windows were, and the latch was undisturbed. She looked at the door, the only entry. The ICU had a controlled access corridor. Nobody had buzzed in. Nobody had come through the ICU doors in the past hour. The access log, electronic, time-stamped, confirmed it. The last entry had been the on-call physician at 1:47 a.m. She worked the rest of her shift. She documented Mr. Abrams's death at 3:04 a.m., cause listed as cerebrovascular accident with the standard clinical language of a death record. In the notes section, where nurses sometimes record qualitative observations about the dying process, She wrote very precisely, "Patient appeared to experience a peaceful passing. Room clear of complications." It was the most understated thing she has ever written. 11 years later, sitting across from me, she said, "I have never told that story to anyone I work with, not a single colleague, not the charge nurse who was 3 feet away when I came out of that room, not the social worker who handled Mr. Abrams's case. Nobody." She paused, because the moment I say it out loud in a professional context, it becomes a thing about my credibility and my fitness for the job and my mental state at 3 a.m. on a double shift, and I am not willing to let that be what it is. I asked her what she was willing to let it be. She said, "An old man died alone in a hospital bed. Nobody came when he was alive, but when he was dying, in those last few minutes, someone came. 2 people who cared about him came, and they were there when it mattered, and they held his hand, and they were relieved that it was over for him." She met my eyes. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they were, but I know what I saw. And I know that whatever else happens in that ICU, whatever hard nights I have, whatever I see, I have never once felt since that February night that the people who die in my care die alone. She was quiet for a long moment. Somebody comes, that's what I know now. Somebody always comes. Open Book Chapter 6, The Wrong Road. Marcus has driven long haul for 8 years. He knows the roads the way people who spend their lives on highways know them. Not from maps, but from accumulated hours. From the specific way the light changes over a certain stretch of road at dusk. From the landmarks that aren't on any GPS. From the rhythms and grades and curves that become as familiar as a neighborhood. He knew Highway 49 in Mississippi. He'd run it dozens of times. A clean 2-lane that cut through hill country in the northern part of the state, forested, rising and falling. The kind of road that's satisfying to drive because it requires real attention, not the hypnotic nothing of interstate monotony. He was southbound on 49 on a Tuesday night in October 2020, running a load of industrial equipment from Memphis to a distribution center outside Jackson. He was on schedule. He was alert. He'd stopped for coffee in Grenada, and the caffeine was doing its job. The night was clear, no weather, a full moon hanging over the hill country and the forest on both sides of the road. At 3:01 a.m., he rounded a curve he'd rounded before and found a woman standing in the road. Middle of the lane, not the shoulder. The middle of the southbound lane facing him caught in his headlights. She was wearing a white dress that the headlights made incandescent. That detail hit him first, that the dress was too bright, almost luminous in the beams. She was young, dark hair. She was standing very still. Marcus braked. He was driving professionally, under the speed limit, alert, seat belt on. He had the truck under control. He braked hard and clean and brought the rig to a stop on the road, and he was out of the cab before the truck had fully stopped rocking, his heart doing the specific terrified arithmetic of someone who has come very close to killing a person with a very large vehicle. He went to the front of the truck. The road was empty. He checked under the truck. He checked both sides of the road, both shoulders, 10 feet in each direction into the tree line. He had his flashlight and he used it, and he found nothing. No tire marks that would indicate a person struck and thrown. No drag marks. No blood, no clothing. No indication that any body had been in any contact with his vehicle. He stood on the empty road at 3 a.m. in the Mississippi Hill country with the engine ticking and the forest very dark and very close on both sides, and he felt. This is how he described it. He felt the specific, cold clarity of someone who has just been forced to know something they cannot unknow. He called it in. He reported a potential pedestrian hazard to the state police non-emergency line, gave his location by mile marker, described what he'd seen. The dispatcher was professional and took his report and told him a unit would check the area. Marcus sat in his cab for 20 minutes waiting. The unit arrived, 2 officers. They walked the road in both shoulders and the tree line in both directions for a quarter mile. They found nothing. One of the officers came to Marcus's cab. He was a man in his 40s, local to the area. He took Marcus's statement and then, in the way of someone choosing their words with particular care, he asked Marcus what the woman was wearing. Marcus said, "A white dress." The officer wrote this down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if Marcus had ever driven this stretch of 49 before. Marcus said yes, many times. The officer said, "Have you heard the local name for this road?" Marcus said he hadn't. The officer said he didn't know if he should tell him this or not, but that this specific section of Highway 49, the 3 miles between mile marker 171 and 174, in the curve where Marcus had braked, was known locally as Annabelle Stretch. Marcus said, "Who's Annabelle?" The officer put his notebook away. He said, "A girl who died on this road in 1987. She was 19. She'd been at a party in Coffeyville and she was walking home on the road and a truck hit her. She was wearing a white dress." Marcus was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "Did the truck driver stop?" The officer said he did not. Marcus has run Highway 49 since that night. He runs it in the day now. He doesn't run it at night. He doesn't explain why to his dispatcher. He told me he's thought about Annabelle for 3 years, about what it means that she's still on that road, about whether she's trying to stop trucks or whether she's just there, present, replaying the last moment, or whether she's doing something else entirely, something Marcus doesn't have a framework for. He said the truck driver didn't stop. In 1987, somebody hit a 19-year-old girl in a white dress on a road in Mississippi, and they did not stop, and she's been on that road ever since. He was quiet. I think about that when people ask me why I report incidents even when I'm not sure what I saw, why I always stop, why I always check, why it matters to stop. He looked out the window of the diner we were sitting in, at the highway visible in the distance. Somebody should have stopped. Somebody should have stopped a long time ago. Open Book Chapter 7, The Voice on the Monitor. Paul and Christine tell this story together. They have told it twice since it happened, once to Christine's parents, who received it with the kind of respectful silence that suggests they believed it but had chosen not to say so, and once to me. Their daughter May was 6 weeks old in January 2022. She was sleeping in a bassinet in their bedroom, monitored by a standard audio baby monitor, the kind that transmits one-way audio from the baby's side to a small receiver unit that the parents keep on their nightstand. No video, just sound. Paul is a software engineer who had, in the months before May's birth, done extensive research on baby monitor technology, including its known vulnerabilities. The fact that certain radio frequency monitors can pick up signals from other monitors in the area, from cordless phones, from certain radio equipment. He was aware of this. He had purchased a model rated for low interference and had positioned it according to the manufacturer's specifications. He had tested it before May arrived. He was, in the prepared parent way of engineers expecting their first child, very thorough about this. He had not been able to prepare for what the monitor transmitted at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday night in January. Christine heard it first. She was partially awake, the light sleep of a new mother, tuned to any sound from the bassinet, when she heard a voice come through the monitor. Not May. May was asleep. Christine could hear her breathing in the background, that small, snuffling sound of a newborn in deep sleep. The voice was an old woman's, gentle, unhurried, speaking in Mandarin. Christine grew up speaking Mandarin. She sat up in bed and she listened to the voice, and Paul, beside her, woke to find his wife sitting absolutely still with tears running down her face. He said her name. She held up one hand, wait. She listened. The voice spoke for approximately 2 minutes, Paul estimates, before going silent. Christine sat with the monitor in her hands for another full minute after it went quiet. Then she put it down on the nightstand. Paul said, "Christine, what was that?" Christine said, "My grandmother." Christine's maternal grandmother, Nai she called her, a woman named Wu Lihua, had died in 2019 in Chengdu, China. Christine had not been able to travel for the funeral. It was one of the losses she carried with unresolved weight, the not being there, the distance, the grief that never quite closed because there had been no proper goodbye. Wu Lihua had been alive for the announcement of Christine's pregnancy, but had died before May was born. Christine told me what her grandmother said through the baby monitor at 3:17 a.m. She told me in both Mandarin and English because she said she needed me to have both. Needed me to hear the words her grandmother used, and not just their translation. Her grandmother said, "May is beautiful, she looks like you did. She is going to be strong. I can see it already." She said, "Christine, I know you are tired. Rest. I am watching over her." She said, "Tell your mother I said hello." And then she said, "This baby already knows who she is. Don't worry, she already knows." Christine told me she didn't sleep after that. She held May in the dark of their bedroom in Seattle at 3 a.m. in January, and she talked to her grandmother, aloud, quietly, so as not to wake Paul, and she said all the things she had not been able to say at the funeral she hadn't attended. And she felt, she told me, the specific quality of being heard that she recognized from the conversations she'd had with her grandmother her whole life. That attentive, warm, entirely focused quality of being listened to by someone who has nowhere else to be, and no one else they would rather be with. Paul had the monitor analyzed. He had a friend in RF engineering look at the frequency data logged by the unit. The friend found nothing anomalous in the signal. The monitor had been functioning normally, receiving only the signal from its paired transmitter unit in the bedroom. He had no explanation for a voice on a single frequency paired monitor with no external signal source. Paul said when I spoke to him, "I didn't hear the words. I heard the voice, the tone and the cadence of it, and I watched my wife's face. And her face told me everything I needed to know about whether it was real." He paused. "My wife has a specific expression she gets when she talks to her grandmother. I've seen it on video calls and in person and in old photographs she has from childhood. I saw it at 3 a.m. in January when she was listening to the monitor." He stopped. "I didn't need to hear the words. May is 2 years old now. She is, by all accounts, exactly what Wu Lihua said she would be, strong and entirely certain of who she is." Christine told me that sometimes, when she holds May in the early mornings, May will look at a corner of the room, a specific corner, always the same one, and smile at it. The wide, delighted, social smile of a child who recognizes a familiar face. Christine never asks who May is smiling at. She already knows. Open Book Chapter 8, The Knocking. This is the most recent account in tonight's compilation, submitted just 6 months ago. Erin is 24. She is finishing her master's degree in public health at Boston University and lives in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Fenway neighborhood with a roommate named Jess, who works early morning shifts at a bakery and is reliably in bed by 9 p.m. on weeknights. Erin is not, by her own description, a person who reads about the paranormal or thinks about things going bump in the night. She is practical and data-oriented and does not, as a rule, spend much time on the unexplained. She submitted her account because she had read one of my previous compilations and felt, she said, that someone who took these things seriously would know what to make of what happened to her. She was awake at 3 a.m. on a Thursday night in September 2023 because she was studying an exam the following morning on epidemiological modeling. She was at her desk in the bedroom she used as a study, surrounded by the specific chaos of a public health student who has been trying to understand disease transmission curves for 6 hours. The apartment building was a 1960s brick 6-story. Her bedroom window faced the air shaft between buildings. She had been living there for 14 months. She knew its sounds. At 3:09 a.m., someone knocked on her bedroom door. She assumed it was Jess. Jess sometimes woke early, her shift started at 4 a.m., and occasionally knocked to ask if Aaron wanted anything from the bakery. Aaron said, "Come in, Jess." Nobody came in. She said it again, "Come in." Nothing. She got up and opened the door. The hallway outside her bedroom was empty. Jess's bedroom door at the far end of the hall was closed. She could hear Jess's white noise machine running behind it. It was a sound she knew, constant and specific. She had not imagined the knock. 2 knocks, distinct, deliberate, clearly on the door of her room, but nobody there. She went back to her desk. She decided it was a building sound that had happened to land on her door, settling. A pipe, a neighbor's movement transmitted through the structure. She went back to her epidemiological curves. At 3:17 a.m., 2 more knocks. Same door, same deliberate quality. She got up again. Same empty hallway. Jess's door still closed, the white noise machine still running. She stood in the hallway for a moment and then, in what she describes as a decision that I cannot entirely explain except that it felt right, she said aloud. "Okay, I know you're there. What do you want?" The hallway was quiet. Then her phone on her desk in the bedroom buzzed. She went to her phone. The notification was from her sister Kelly, who lived in Portland, Oregon. A text message sent at 3:17 a.m. Pacific time, which was, "Aaron did the math, heart accelerating 6:17 a.m. in Portland." The text said, "Aaron, call me please, something happened." Aaron called. Kelly answered immediately. Kelly, 26, who Aaron had always been close to with the specific closeness of sisters who are 2 years apart and have each other's entire history. Kelly was crying, trying not to show it, the specific controlled voice of someone delivering news they have been waiting to deliver as soon as the receiving person was reachable. Their father had had a cardiac event that morning. In Portland. He was in the emergency department. He was, at the time of Kelly's text, stable. It had been a warning, not a full attack, and he was being assessed and would be fine, Kelly believed. The doctors believed, but Kelly had been awake for 3 hours in the waiting room of a hospital in Portland, and had been trying not to alarm anyone, and had finally decided at 6 a.m. that she needed her sister. Aaron flew to Portland the next morning. Her father had 2 stents placed and was home within the week. He is at present fine. Aaron has thought for 6 months about the sequence. The knocking at 3:09 a.m., the second knocking at 3:17 a.m., and at 3:17 a.m. her sister's text from Portland, where her father was in an emergency room. She is a public health student. She thinks in terms of mechanisms and causal pathways. She cannot construct a causal pathway for what happened. She cannot explain what knocked on her door or how it knew or what it was doing or why it woke her to the doorway and to alertness at the precise moment that her sister was reaching out. She said, "I don't have a framework for this. I have frameworks for a lot of things, but not this. Not for what knocked on my door at 3 a.m. when my dad was in the hospital." She paused. "But here's what I keep coming back to. Whatever knocked, whatever it was, whatever moved in my hallway that night, it didn't scare me. Both times I went to the door, I wasn't afraid. I was confused, but I wasn't afraid. And that matters, I think. I think if something is using 3 a.m. to reach you, if it has an opportunity to reach you in the silence and the dark, and it uses it to knock on your door so you're awake when your sister calls." She stopped. "I don't think that's something to be afraid of." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think that's something to be grateful for." Open Book Chapter 9, The Last Passenger. Dominic has been driving the same night bus route for 22 years. Route 14 in San Antonio runs from the Medical Center District on the northwest side through downtown and east to the East Side neighborhood, terminating at a stop near the old Dignity Park at the end of the line. It is an 11-mile run. Dominic has driven it so many thousands of times that he has stopped trying to count. The night service is different from the day. The demographics shift, late workers coming off shift at hospitals and hotels, nightlife crowd earlier in the evening, and then, in the small hours after midnight, the people who don't have anywhere else to be. Dominic knows his regular late riders the way you know anyone you see 3 times a week for years. Not their names, usually, but their faces, their stops, the particular weight of their presence. He told me about the man at the Flores Street stop. The Flores Street stop is at the 3/4 point of the route, a shelter on a quiet block in the southern part of downtown that gets very little traffic after midnight. On the night in question, a Wednesday in March 2016, around 3 a.m. Dominic pulled up to the Flores stop on his last run of the night. There was a man waiting. Old man, 70s, maybe 80s, neat. A gray coat that was too warm for a March night in Texas, black trousers. Shoes that had been well maintained for a long time. He boarded slowly, the way old men board buses, careful with his balance, one hand on the pole. He dropped his fare, the correct fare, coins, which Dominic noted because that was already unusual. Most late-night riders used passes or phones. He took the seat directly behind the driver, which is where people who want to feel safe on a late bus sit. He sat down. He looked straight ahead. Dominic said, "Evening," in the way he said it to every boarding passenger. The man nodded but said nothing. The bus pulled away from Flores. 3 stops later, at the Santa Rosa stop near the old hospital, Dominic checked his mirror. The seat behind the driver was empty. Dominic pulled the bus to the curb and put it in park. He walked the full length of the bus. 8 passengers, all of whom he knew by sight, the night nurses from the hospital 2 stops back, the young man who got on every Wednesday night near the river, 2 women who rode together and always got off at the same stop. All present, all where they should be. No old man. Dominic has been driving buses for 22 years. He knows when a passenger gets off his bus. He knows the sound and the motion and the air pressure change of a bus door opening. The door had not opened between Flores Street and Santa Rosa. The man was not on the bus. He drove the rest of the run thinking about it. He filed a brief incident report, unusual passenger, unconfirmed exit, and drove home. The next Wednesday night, he pulled up to the Flores Street stop at 3 a.m. The man was there. Same gray coat, same patient stillness. He boarded, dropped his fare, sat behind the driver, nodded when Dominic said evening. 3 stops later, he was gone. This happened 4 more times across 6 weeks. Same man, same stop, same seat, same 3 stops before he vanished without the door opening. On the 6th Wednesday, Dominic decided to talk to him. He waited until the bus was moving after the Flores stop, waited until they'd pulled away from the curb and were moving through the quiet late streets. And then he said to the man in the seat behind him, to the mirror above his head, "Sir, I've been seeing you every Wednesday at this stop for about 6 weeks." The man looked at Dominic's mirror. He said, in an accented Spanish that Dominic described as old-fashioned, formal, the Spanish of a previous generation, "I know. I'm sorry if I've caused any trouble." Dominic said, "No trouble, I just want to understand." The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I used to take this bus home, a long time ago, from work." Dominic said, "Where did you work?" The man said, "The hospital, the old Nix Hospital on Navarro." Dominic knew the Nix Hospital. It had been one of San Antonio's oldest, a tower on Navarro Street downtown. It had closed in 2012 after a long decline. He drove past the building sometimes. It was in the process of being converted to condominiums. He said, "The Nix closed a few years ago." The man said, "Yes, I know," a pause. "I worked there for 40 years. I was a porter. I took the bus home every night after the last shift." Dominic said, "What stop did you get off at?" The man said Santa Rosa, which was, of course, exactly the stop where he disappeared every week. Dominic looked at his mirror. The old man was looking out the window at the dark streets, familiar streets, streets he would have passed hundreds of times on this same bus, in the same seat, looking out the same windows at a city that had changed around him. Dominic said carefully, "Sir, can I ask, why do you keep taking this bus?" The man was quiet for a long moment. He was watching the streets outside. He said, "Because I know this route, because it still goes where I'm going." He paused. "Because the driver always says evening, and at 3 in the morning that matters." Dominic checked his mirror as they approached the Santa Rosa stop. The old man was watching the stop come. He looked at Dominic's mirror one final time. He said, "Thank you for always saying evening." Dominic pulled up to the Santa Rosa stop. The doors opened for the existing passengers. He checked his mirror. The seat was empty. Dominic told me he researched the Nix hospital afterward. He found records of its staff going back decades. In the employee records preserved by the San Antonio Conservation Society, he found the name of a porter who had worked at the Nix for 37 years and had retired in 1989. An old man by then, retired, lived in the East Side neighborhood. He died in 1994. His route home every night from the Nix hospital for 37 years had been Route 14. Pause. Dominic has driven past the Flora Street stop every Wednesday night at 3 a.m. since 2016. The old man has not been there since that last Wednesday, since the night he said thank you and disappeared for the last time at the Santa Rosa stop. Dominic told me he missed him. He said, 22 years on this route, I've had a lot of passengers. I remember the ones who were polite, the ones who treated the bus like it mattered. He was always polite. He always had exact fare. He always sat quietly and he never gave anyone trouble." He paused. And he was right. At 3 a.m., someone saying evening matters. I say it to everyone now. Every late-night passenger. Every person boarding at 3 a.m. when the city is quiet and the bus is half empty and they're tired or scared or just trying to get home. I say it because a man who'd been dead for 20 years taught me it mattered. He was quiet for a moment. I think he just wanted to finish the ride. 40 years on that route and then it all stopped, the job, the bus, eventually him. And he just couldn't let the ride end, couldn't let it be over. He looked at the window. I hope he found his stop. I hope wherever he got off, it was where he was going. Open Book Chapter 10, The Window in the North. Judith went to the cabin to grieve. Her husband Thomas had died in October 2023 after a 2-year illness. They had been married for 31 years. The cabin, a small, insulated structure on a lake in Lake County, in the far northeastern corner of Minnesota, had been Thomas's place first, inherited from his uncle, a fishing cabin that he'd brought Judith to on their second date and where they had returned every winter for 30 years to be away from everything. It was a place that held them in the way that some places hold people, the specific places where the best of a life has happened, where the accumulated weight of joy is so dense it has become structural. She went there alone in January 2024, 3 months after Thomas died, because she needed to be somewhere that was wholly his and wholly theirs, because the house in Minneapolis was too big without him and the grief in a city feels different than grief in the wilderness. Urban grief is surrounded by distraction, by the noise of a world that doesn't stop, and Judith needed something different. She needed silence that was honest. She needed the lake. She arrived on a Friday evening in January in 30 below wind chill, and lit the wood stove and made herself dinner and sat with a glass of wine and Thomas's absence in the warmth of the cabin. And she cried for 2 hours and then felt better than she had in months. She went to bed at 10. She slept deeply. She woke at 3 a.m. Not gradually, all at once, completely alert in the absolute dark of a northern Minnesota winter night. A dark that has a weight and a totality that is different from anywhere else in the country. The dark of a place where the nearest town is 40 minutes on an unplowed road, and there is no ambient light from any source except the stars, and tonight, a quarter moon. She lay still, she listened. The cabin was quiet. The stove was low. The lake ice, 100 yards from the cabin, made the periodic groaning, cracking sound that lake ice makes in the deep cold, a sound she knew, had known for 30 years, not alarming. Then she heard something at the window. The cabin had 4 windows. The one above the bed faced north toward the lake. She heard something at the north window, a sound she did not immediately classify, a sound that was neither the ice nor the wind nor any weather sound she knew. It was a tapping, light, irregular, like ice forming on the glass, except it was too deliberate for ice, too patterned. She turned on the small lamp on the nightstand. She sat up in bed and looked at the north window. The window was fogged with condensation. The temperature differential between inside and outside was enormous, and the glass was always fogged by morning. In the condensation from outside, something had drawn a shape. She could not, in the dim lamplight, immediately make out what the shape was. She got up and went to the window and looked. A hand, an outline of a hand, drawn in the condensation by a finger pressed against the glass from outside, palm and 5 fingers, the right hand by the position of the thumb. Thomas was right-handed. Judith stood at the north window of the cabin at 3 a.m. in January in northern Minnesota, looking at the handprint in the condensation, and she placed her own right hand against it, palm to palm, fingers to fingers, through the glass. She stood there for a long time. Then she said, to the window, to the handprint, to whatever was on the other side of the glass on a night 30 below zero on the shore of a frozen lake, Thomas. The condensation fogged further. She watched it happen, a new bloom of fog spreading from where the handprint was, as if something on the other side had leaned in close, had pressed itself against the glass. She said, I know, I love you too. She went back to bed. She left the lamp on. She lay with her hand on his side of the bed, on the pillow that had held his head for 30 winters, and she talked to the window in the dark until she fell asleep. She woke at 3 a.m. the second night and the third. Every night for 8 nights, she woke at exactly 3 a.m. to the tapping at the north window. Every night, a handprint in the condensation. Every night she pressed her hand to it and talked. On the 8th night, a Friday, so she'd been there a full week, she woke at 3 a.m. and lay still and listened. The tapping did not come. She waited. It did not come. She got up anyway and went to the north window. The glass was fogged. She looked. No handprint. But in the condensation, something had written, in the uneven script of a finger dragged slowly through fog. Go home. 2 words. In the condensation on the outside of a cabin window, in 30 below darkness on the shore of a frozen lake. Judith stood at the window for a long time. Then she said, okay. She said, okay, Thomas, I'll go home. She packed the next morning. She closed the cabin and drove the 40 minutes to the plowed road, and then the 3 hours south to Minneapolis. She drove back to the house that was too big without him, and she unlocked the door and she stood in the hallway and she let herself feel it, the whole size and weight of it, the life they had built there, the 31 years in those rooms. She told me, he knew I needed to be at the cabin to grieve it. He knew I needed to be somewhere that was completely ours without any of the noise of ordinary life to really understand that he was gone. And I think he came to the window every night while I was there. I think he was there the whole week. And then when he thought I was ready. She stopped. She said he sent me home. I asked her if she was okay. It is a simple question, and I don't ask it often in these interviews, but I asked Judith because I needed to know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I have thought about every day since she said it. She said, Grief at 3 a.m. is different than grief in the daylight. In the daylight, grief is wide. It's in everything. It's in the coffee cup he used, and the car space in the garage, and the television shows he watched, and the way the house sounds different without his footsteps. In the daylight, grief is everywhere. She paused. But at 3 a.m. at the nadir at the bottom of the clock, grief is specific. It's just you and the person you lost, without all the rest of it. Without the noise. Without the world going on without them. Just you and them in the dark and the window between you. She looked at me. I think that's why 3 a.m. is when things come through. Not because it's when the veil is thinnest, or whatever people say. Because it's when we're quiet enough to hear them. Because it's the only hour when we stop filling the silence with everything else, and we sit still long enough to feel what's always been there. She said, they're always there. We're just too loud the rest of the time. I don't know if she's right. But I've thought about nothing else since the day she said it. 10 people, 10 nights, 10 encounters at the bottom of the human clock. A kitchen light left on. A man who couldn't leave his life's work behind. An old radio playing music it had no power to play. A farmer's ancestor in a drought-dry field. A nurse who now knows nobody dies alone. A girl still standing in the road where she was left. A grandmother's voice through a monitor. A door knocked by something that knew what was happening 3 time zones away. A bus driver who gave a dead man the last kind word of his nightly ride. And a woman at a window in a northern winter, hand pressed to glass, saying goodbye. The scientists call it the nadir, the lowest point, the hour of greatest vulnerability. But here is what I've come to believe. After 10 accounts and 10 nights, and 10 people who were awake in the dark when the rest of the world was sleeping, the nadir is also the opening. Not because the dead are more active at 3 a.m., not because the veil thins on some mystical schedule, but because we, the living, are different at 3 a.m. We are stripped. We are quiet. We have put down for a few hours every defense and distraction and performance that gets us through the daylight, and in that putting down we become, as Judith said, able to hear what is always there. The question I leave you with tonight is not what these 10 people encountered. It's what you have encountered. Because if you have ever woken at 3 a.m. with no reason, heart beating, the dark around you charged with something you couldn't name, if you have ever stood in a quiet room and felt, with total certainty, that you were not alone, if you have ever heard your name in a house that should have been empty, maybe you weren't imagining it. Maybe you were just quiet enough, finally, to hear. If you have a 3 a.m. story, if the night has brought you something you've never found a home for, you know where to find me. I'm always up late. And tonight, if you're watching this in the dark, notice what time it is. Sleep well.